Hi, welcome to this very special Underworld Uncut discussion about the Krays. We're live from Uncut HQ. I'm Hayley Rhodes. I'm joined by Kate Beal-Blyth, who's the CEO of Woodcut Media.
Hello.
And author of The Krays, The Prison Years. Also here is Andre, who's the producer of a brand new documentary about the Krays. It's called Krays London Gangsters, which lands on Amazon Prime Video tomorrow. Why did you want to make a brand new documentary about the Krays?
Well, it was actually kind of Kate came to me and said that she had got hold of some tapes.
Acquired
some tapes that Reggie Kray had recorded in prison for his brother Ronnie. So it's a very personal tape that was meant to go straight to Ronnie. And he doesn't say anything kind of hugely consequential, but it was a very intimate kind of conversation between two people who knew each other really well. And so we thought it was an interesting kind of catalyst to explore that relationship of the two brothers, but also kind of look at the kind of social surroundings that they grew up in, and kind of look at it from that perspective.
Okay, I'm intrigued about these tapes. I'm going to ask you in a moment. But first, we want all of your questions. Andre and Kate, between them, know quite a lot about the Krays, so please pop your questions in the comments. So these tapes, how do you acquire tapes from the Krays?
It is a strange thing because I sort of look at my life and think, well, how have I become, sort of this strange craze expert? But I think I'm a program maker, I'm a storyteller, and I have made 4 documentaries in the kind of Kray world. So The Krays by Fred Dinage, The Richardsons by Fred Dinage, Frankie Fraser's Last Stand, and The Krays, The Prison Years. And now Andre's films are the sort of the next instalment. And it's just such a fascinating kind of legacy legend, although horrible in so many ways, but also kind of a part of our social history as a country. And I think because I did the book as well, The Krays, The Prison Years with David Meikle, I'm visible. And so I had this call to say I have these tapes, and I got the tapes and listened to them, and they're just incredible. And I can't wait for people to hear them when they see it on the documentary tomorrow, because it is just something that you just hear Reggie's voice. And as somebody who's made lots of programs about Ronnie and Reggie, and I've never met them, they were in prison for all of my life. I was born after they went to prison. I've met many of their compatriots and their associates, but I've never met them. So to hear such kind of an intimate, sort of telling of their story from Reggie was quite unusual.
Yeah, I mean, they are amazing because they're not for public consumption. They're not there to kind of put across this image of what the Krays had, of being these kind of glamorous gangsters. They are very much for each other.
It's 2 brothers talking. It's a brother talking to another brother, and in difficult circumstances because it was recorded in prison. And I think actually that kind of sums up the Krays story in some ways. So they're like this world famous 2 men that kind of have quite literally got a film called Legend. But actually, at the end of the day, they were 2 men. They were 2 ordinary human beings who committed horrific crimes and ended up in prison for that. But they were also brothers who loved each other.
So I don't know how much you knew about the Krays before you started on this project. What was what was your starting point, and what did you find out along the way?
I actually didn't know much about them at all, which actually was a good thing, because obviously they come with a lot of baggage. Some people very much kind of think, the glamour that surrounds them is misplaced, and they were kind of quite violent murderers in the end. And some people have a very kind of high opinion of them. They're kind of working class heroes. And I didn't come with any of that. So it was kind of interesting to kind of explore this, and explore it, in a way, kind of trying to unpick, what made these 2 guys tick, really. Because, they're growing up in a very kind of violent surrounding. They grew up kind of during World War II. They saw violence. Violence was currency at the time. But then many people lived through that and grew up through that. And so kind of what was a bit different about them that led them on the path that they went down? And actually them being twins was a fascinating aspect of that. And the more I looked into it, and the more you understood that the twin relationship would have had a huge impact on them. We don't know that because no psychologists kind of were analyzing them when they were children, but you can kind of tell that clearly had an impact, and that was kind of really fascinating to look at it from that angle.
It seemed to have an impact in sort of more than one way. So there's a kind of almost being tiny celebrities from birth, because twins are not something you see all the time.
Well, especially then. So at that time in the East End of London, kind of the fact that Violet Kray had two surviving twins, and Ronnie actually nearly died when he was 3. So the fact that they survived and were twins, they were instant celebrities, as was their mother. And so I think they grew up with that. They grew up with being, seen as other.
I think that's fascinating, because I'd love to be able to see sort of that idea of Violet Kray walking around with her pram, with her twins, that people are like, oh my goodness, aren't they beautiful? And that kind of, the idea of celebrity, but also Violet, because she's a fascinating woman who sort of all the way through their story just has such a kind of fundamental part to the fact that she kind of grew in her status because of them. So it's this kind of symbiotic.
Yes, it was almost in her interest to allow them to develop into the people that they became. I wonder if she ever didn't want them to become what they became.
It's interesting, isn't it? She was a mum, and as a mum myself, you care and love and fiercely protect your children. And so actually, I often wonder about her, of how did she feel? They talk about, when they've been arrested, or if they're visits, in jail or waiting for court trial or that sort of thing. Violet would turn up with food, or would turn up with neatly pressed shirts, and her sons were always taken care of. And sort of, you're not going to abandon your son at that point, or your sons. So it's that sort of strange. I'd love to have met her. If there's anybody in the Krays story who I wish I'd met, it was her, because it must be really complicated, because it'd be kind of proud.
How much she actually did know. Because I think there was, at the time, probably there was this idea that they were lovable rogues and they weren't doing anything too bad. And so I think she could probably tell herself that her sons were, they might be not completely above board, but it wasn't to the extent that maybe kind of we know now that they were.
No, and they were beloved in the community by certain people. I used to visit this very small, fierce little old lady in Bethnal Green who remembered them from back in the day, and who only had good things to say about them, and that was obviously their reputation within the community. And I wonder if she heard more of that than she heard about the violence.
Yeah, I mean, everybody I've spoken to is they that knew them said, on the face of it, they were lovely. They were gentlemen, and they wanted to present themselves as such. The way they dressed and the way they presented themselves, they wanted to be movie stars. But obviously, the world that they lived in, and the kind of the sort of business they were in, it required violence, sometimes extreme violence, and obviously that spiraled then into murder. But I think, in some ways, they were kind of keeping the peace as well. Nobody would mess with certain kind of people or with certain neighborhoods if the Krays were protecting that neighborhood.
I have to say, I get people who I've met say that thing. I do wonder sometimes if that mythology has just become even more so, and that kind of how even now I sort of go, oh, when I was young it was so much better. I mean they do say, all the people who said they were lovely, they also completely saw the violent side and were appalled by it. So I think it's a double-edged. It's kind of they could see both sides. So I don't think it's I think the thing of what they could have become, and I think the context of where they grew up, and the East End of London in the wartime, pre-war, war, and post-war, and that absolute poverty. You talk about violence. There were houses being bombed all around them. Some of their comrades, as it were, learnt their skills. It's well known that Frankie Fraser would learn his skills of kind of looting and theft in World War II. Right. And so you sort of wonder if they had grown up in a different place in a different time, what they'd become. I did a documentary with a man called Charlie Richardson, and Charlie Richardson is the famous part of the Richardson gang, Eddie and Charlie, rivals to the twins. And meeting Charlie myself, but also talking to other people about Charlie, he was a hugely intelligent man. Actually, if he'd grown up in a place where he could have gone into the city and worked in business and finance, he probably would have done really well. But he didn't grow up there. He didn't start out that way. And actually, with the twins, would the twins have been the next Richard Burton? Would it have been the next Charlton Heston? Actually,
or a great career in PR, because that's what they were good at.
Would they be like modern day influencers? Would they be? you know, if it was now, would they be all over kind of TikTok? Probably done quite well. I'm just going to say, because I'm super excited about tonight and it's live, and I want to take a moment to say thank you to our subscribers, because we have at sort of Uncut put quite a lot of heart and effort into bringing these films, and doing this live is really good. And the reason we started doing this live is because we hit 10,000 subscribers a couple of weeks ago, and our sister channel, almost on the same day, True Crime Uncut, also hit 10,000 subscribers. So it is to talk about the Krays, and it is all of that good stuff, but actually we just want to say thank you as well, and that's why we're here.
Thank you very much.
And it is super exciting doing it.
It is really exciting.
So please, any questions, we're here for
keep
it.
sending the questions. So over the course of writing 4 books essentially about the Krays, has your view of them changed? Have you found them have you become more sympathetic to them? Have you become less sympathetic to them? Has that changed over the period of time that you've been kind of learning about them?
It's interesting. So yeah, I've done 4 docs and 1 book, and I this is a confession actually. I've never seen the Kemp Brothers Krays film. I've never seen Legend. I've never seen any fictional work about the Krays. Anything I've learned about the Krays has either been I've read or I've spoken to first-hand accounts. So speaking to people like Chris Lambriano or Frankie Fraser or Freddie Foreman or Wilf Pine, who actually physically knew the twins. And so as a program maker, you kind of take all of this information in and then process it so the viewer will, understand it and be informed and entertained. And so it's not my place to judge. I find it, if I'm truthful, I find the Krays story quite sad, because I think they were remarkable characters who in a different time, different place would have done very different things. And what ended up happening was, due to the circumstances, they committed heinous acts. And ultimately, these potentially talented people spent most of their life in prison, half their life in prison, died in prison. And actually, going back to the tapes, the Reggie tapes, it's clear how sad it is. And actually, in every documentary that I've made, you kind of end on a note of sadness that crime doesn't pay. It's, like there's a book here. This is the book that sort of started it all, which is Our Story by Ronnie and Reg, that was written by Fred Dinenage. And actually, yes, there's the kind of gangster stuff in it, but there's also sort of, talking about when they're free and where they're going to live together. And, they want to live, I think it was they wanted to move to Dorset by the sea. And
Why were they never freed? Like, were they just not remorseful enough?
Yes, I think they weren't remorseful enough. And I mean, I'm not so clear about it, but essentially I think they became too famous. It would be too, I think, their kind of celebrity, I think, kept them in to some extent.
Okay.
Because it was such a, letting them out was such a kind of, would have been such a momentous occasion.
Do you get the impression from everything that you learned while you were making this that they would have actually been okay to have been freed? They would have just, well, in terms of their own actions, they would have just rejoined society?
Well, I mean, the key thing with especially kind of Ronnie and to some degree Reggie, I think, is mental health. I mean...
Because he was at Broadmoor?
Yeah, Ronnie was, and he was kind of also already kind of in his 20s diagnosed at that point with paranoid schizophrenia. So, the question is also, did he get the help that he would have needed or would have gotten today, in the 50s? Would it have been different? Would the outcome would have been different? And I'm sure because of Reggie having to deal with his brother's mental health, which often kind of, resulted in extreme violence, it affected him. And some people some who knew him said absolutely Ronnie's actions and his kind of issues with mental health is what drove Reggie to have his own mental health problems and then the second murder. So I think mental health kind of is a huge factor in all this as well.
I do, it's interesting because speaking to so many different people, and everyone has a different opinion, and they're all kind of right and wrong, because I don't know, I've never met the Krays, I can only listen to what other people have said. And some people say it was all about, Ronnie's mental health, and Ronnie forced Reggie, and Reggie was the nice one, and Ronnie was the mental one. And but actually, then there are other people who say, well, actually, Ronnie was quite in a weird way, a simplistic guy, because he was led by his heart and his emotions and had these kind of mental health episodes. And actually Reggie was more sort of I don't know how to describe it, but more kind of knowing of what he was doing.
He was in control of his actions.
He was more of a control. So actually, there is an argument that Reggie was controlling Ronnie in some ways. But it depends who you speak to. Some people are more friends with Ronnie, some are more friends with Reggie.
And that's a fascinating thing about the kind of whole twin relationship. So obviously, this goes without saying, but nobody analysed them when they were younger. But speaking to experts who are experts in twin relationships, that it can be that the relationship is extremely intertwined, especially if kind of growing up that twin relationship was promoted and kind of hailed and that their lives can be really intertwined. So I think that's what happened with the kind of Krays, is they couldn't live with each other or without each other. And even though when they weren't great for each other, they couldn't be apart. And when they were good with each other, they were great together. So I think it was a very kind of complex relationship that led to all sorts of things.
Yes, I found the bit where he, Reggie married, is it Francis? And then Ronnie just couldn't kind of let go of him enough to let them have a proper married relationship, and he almost kept trying to encroach upon their marriage, and it obviously ended very badly. Yeah.
I mean, again, it's kind of complete kind of hearsay, but there was some people kind of some people have said he was actually quite nice to her, but other people have said he was a bully to her, and then Francis took her life as well, and kind of the reason for that is unclear, but many people will kind of blame the kind of pressure she was under from Ronnie, but again, that's
it's kind of looking at it retrospectively. We need to take a 2-minute break, but we'll be back with you really soon. Welcome back. We're still here talking about the Krays. Kate, one thing I'm really curious about is how did this sort of life, I don't want to call it an obsession, but how did your interest in the Krays kick off?
Well, it's a really strange thing, and I think that's the thing about television and working in television. You kind of become a master of subjects, and so one day you're doing kind of cookery, or one day you're doing, I don't know, something about a history subject, and then suddenly you're doing the Krays. But ultimately it's always about story and human interest and who, what interests you. And I was at an event by a Royal Television Society event, and a man called Fred Dinage, who's quite a famous presenter in the UK, was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. And I was in the audience listening to Fred give this speech, and Fred was sort of talking about his life and, doing kind of what an amazing life he's had. And he said, and you'll never guess, who'd have thought it, I would have been on in Parkhurst prison on the Isle of Wight talking to Reggie Kray, and who'd have thought I'd have done the Krays biography. And I was sitting in the audience thinking, my goodness, this is amazing. Fred Dinage, who is mostly known to me as children's TV presenter How, or World of Sport, or he's a really famously nice guy, is also the Krays official biographer. And to be that person, and how did that happen? So I went up and had a chat with Fred and said, I'd really like to make a documentary about this. And so that was the first one, which was The Krays by Fred Dinage, which was done in 2009, 2010. And at the time we were filming with Fred, and it was just an incredible experience where he was going to go and meet people he'd known for many years, because he wrote the book in the 80s. He got this call from Ronnie and Reggie essentially and said, we want you to write our book, and you don't really say no to Ronnie and Reggie. And Fred is such a good storyteller, so there are so many kind of great anecdotes he had. And so we made this documentary where he went and met Frankie Fraser again, and Freddie Foreman, and Bobby Cummins, and brilliant people called Billy and Lenny, and he sort of did a tour of kind of, Valence Road and Bethnal Green, and went to the Carpenter's Arms and Polici's, the cafe. So very much
I've been there.
the kind. Polici's is great.
Yeah, it is.
And so we spent time doing that, and that was a success. And it was a really big hit at the time. And then so we made the follow-up, which was the Richardsons, which was the other side of the story, the Richardsons by Fred Dinage. And then it kind of went on from there. So it's a really bizarre thing, because as I said, I've never watched like the Krays, I've never watched Legend. I'm not clearly, sort of somebody who's going to really be into that. But it's a story of humanity, it's a story of our history. And I very much enjoyed, if that's the right word, meeting the people who were part of it. because they are also incredible characters.
Yeah, there are so many interesting characters. I was really interested. Is it in Lambriani?
Chris Lambriano.
Yes. Yeah. Tell me about him.
Well, he was an associate who joined the kind of Kray gang quite late, and kind of famously was very much kind of there, or kind of was involved in the cleanup of the Jack the Hat McVitie murder, and because of him having to kind of clean up the kind of murder scene, was also sentenced to prison when the Krays were sentenced to prison. So his insight and kind of all the insight of the people who kind of knew them and were lucky enough that they're still kind of with us and gives those first kind of person accounts are fascinating. And they all kind of they tell the same story, that it is, like Kate said, it's a sad story because there was potential there, and it kind of ended in kind of in chaos and tragedy.
And Chris is, I have to say, I've interviewed Chris a couple of times, and obviously you had the pleasure this time. He is a beautiful man, and it's a really classic case of it. It's him and his brother Tony, and he was there on the night of Jack the Hat, and he served 15 years, I think, and missed his children growing up, missed his life as a young man. But then when he came out of prison, he really transformed his life. And so actually, it's an extraordinary story of human resilience. And he worked for this incredible drug rehab facility. He found God and is a very kind of holy man now. And I was, over the past sort of 20, 30 years, really, I think has helped a lot of people because he's had that experience. Yeah. And so, as a kind of person, somebody who likes stories, his story of this sort of, he was involved in one of the most famous crimes in the 20th century, but he then went on to transform other people's lives and make a positive out of it. It's quite something. That's pretty incredible, because obviously there isn't time in the documentary to hear all of that, and that's actually a whole other story in its own right, which is pretty were you really excited about interviewing?
So we had their barrister, Nem Lethbridge, who had a great anecdote. She wasn't their barrister for the big trial where they were put away, but she was defending them kind of for like a lot of the smaller kind of kind of misdemeanor crimes they were kind of getting involved with in the late 50s and early 60s, and she was great because I think she saw the kind of the nice, so to speak, nice side of them, and she because they were also well behaved around her. But she had, some great stories, and she said it was lovely. Ronnie was a lovely guy and a really fascinating person to speak to. But at the same time, she said even though she never saw the violence, she could tell it was there. How it could switch. And she said actually, when she was in the courtrooms, she said the kind of them getting free was very seldom to do with what she said, and it was more to do with the kind of scary guy in the back intimidating the witnesses, who suddenly changed their story. Wow.
I think that thing of knowing the violence is a thing. Yeah. And, I have been nervous meeting some of these people over the years. It's not sort of, as a sort of woman on my own knocking on Charlie Richardson's door going, hi! And, it is a sort of an unusual thing to do in your life. And actually the people we've met, and I think Andre is probably the same, they're in their older stages of their life. So that kind of violence isn't necessarily as present as it was in their 20s or 30s. But somebody like Frankie Fraser, I distinctly remember, because I've interviewed him a couple of times, and we did Frankie Fraser's Last Stand. And I was sitting in a pub interviewing him in Peckham, and like asking question. And he's a raconteur. He had his kind of, this is what Frankie says in it, because he was doing tours and all that kind of stuff. And I asked one question and he didn't like it. And there was just a flash in his eyes, and it actually gave me a chill. Did it? I was like, okay, and I'm changing the subject. So interesting. Because the way we see them right now are granddads or dads, or sort of they're older men who've lived their lives, whereas you still see some of it in them. Yes, and their normal back in the day would have been that you didn't accept someone saying something to you that you didn't like and disrespecting you. So that would have been a normal response for them. It's really interesting. Is it true that when they'd sort of cornered the market in their little corner of London, that they were planning on taking Manchester?
there's all sorts of stories about kind of their great ambitions. Depending on who you speak to, they didn't even kind of have complete control over the East End. So it's, there's kind of a lot of debate about kind of how big they were in the kind of crime world. They certainly kind of tried, and there's all sorts of stories where, people are saying that kind of some gang in Manchester made it quite clear quite quickly that they weren't welcome in Manchester.
Right.
So it's kind of the stories of kind of where they had control and where they didn't control, and how much they kind of were moving into the kind of West End. It's all kind of a bit of a grey area. But certainly I think kind of in the East End, it's accepted that they were in charge.
Yeah.
I think there is that thing of, because they were such publicists, that actually they say the real crime bosses don't let you know who they are.
Yeah.
Right.
Because they're the ones who are actually successful. Yeah. And I think, to your point, that in Manchester there was a Newcastle connection. I think there's a Wales connection. There's also the mafia, the whole kind of Krays mafia. Was there a connection there or not? Certainly in the 80s, I think it was, when they were in prison, which you could argue that the Krays really made their name in prison. They had Charlie Kray had Krayley Enterprises, which was a bodyguard unit that Charlie was running with the name Krayley Enterprises.
And so Charlie's the older brother?
Charlie's the older brother,
okay.
Yeah. And when he had Krayley Enterprises, Frank Sinatra came over, who was famously connected with the mafia.
Yeah.
And Frank Sinatra was protected by Krayley Enterprises as a commercial venture. So there are links, but I don't know if that was pre-prison or post-prison.
So you say they really made their name in prison. How do you mean? Do you mean deliberately?
So there was a book by a man called John Pearson called The Profession of Violence, and that was released in the early 70s. So they went to prison in the late 60s, in 69, and then John Pearson wrote this book that sort of put them on the map. So people did know them, and there was absolutely, the Old Bailey trial and all of that was the kind of publicity fest that we've all heard. Charlton Heston apparently was in the public gallery at the Old Bailey. But I think they weren't quite as big as we think of them now. Yeah. But The Profession of Violence by John Pearson, I think, transformed them into this kind of mythology. And that's when, they were super, super smart. Not for this documentary, but for previous, filmed with a wonderful guy called Wilf Pine. And Wilf Pine, he's got, if you ever get a chance, read his book by John Pearson. It's incredible. He's got such a crazy life. He was the only English man in the Five Families Mafia in New York.
Wow.
Really interesting, but very, very lovely man. And but was Ronnie's business manager for quite some time on the inside.
Right.
Wilf was on the outside and Ronnie was in Broadmoor. And he talks about how they essentially licensed their name. And in a way that we would franchise, you have Specsavers that's franchised around the country. Probably shouldn't say that in relation to the Krays, but the Krays name is also franchised
That's
around.
really interesting.
And that is just that whole kind of business.
I think also kind of it's the fact that gangsters have always been popular. If you look at the Godfather movies, if you look at kind of in the 20s and 30s, gangster movies were all the rage, they're the biggest thing. Yeah. So I think there's always been a fascination with gangsters, and in the kind of entertainment or Scarface but they were all American, and so I think there's this appeal that we've got our own kind of iconic gangsters. Yeah. Iconic because there's the famous David Bailey kind of photo, the black and white photo of them together, and so I think they were kind of adopted kind of by the British as this is our answer to Al Capone.
Our ones, yeah. It's interesting actually that you should talk about films because we've got a viewer question that what did you think of so you said you haven't seen Legend, but what do you make of the Tom Hardy portrayal? Because I know that a lot of, at the time there was sort of this suggestion, as there often is actually with true crime, that they were a bit too glamorized. I mean, Tom Hardy is arguably, quite a handsome man. And that perhaps he made them come across as a bit too appealing.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because if you're going to make them the protagonist of a film, there's always going to be a bit of a you want to like the person you're kind of watching. So there's always going to be that that kind of trap you could fall into. And certainly the kind of the producer of the kind of the original Kray film of the Kemp brothers has since kind of said he regrets that he glamorized them to the extent that he did. So
but they do seem to have been appealing to people. Like they had all of these glamorous, famous women hanging around with them. I mean, so they must have had some.
I mean, I'm sure they had charisma as well, and kind of all the, you know, be it Maureen Flanagan or Nem Lethbridge, they were both kind of, you know, when Ronnie was on good form, they loved him. Yeah, they loved being around him. So I think he had a lot of charisma, and obviously, you know, Reggie, the pictures of Reggie, this kind of good-looking, brooding man. I mean, he was, you know, they looked like movie stars. Just kind of their appearance was alluring. Yeah. And so I can kind of see that people would have fallen under this spell especially if they weren't kind of witnessing the kind of the nasty side. They weren't on the wrong end of it. So, and I think that's, you know, looking back, and I think that's the reason why I think they are kind of glamorized, or allowed to be glamorized, is because a lot of people think they've paid their due. Right. They were caught. If they hadn't been caught, if they were still kind of living large in kind of some South American kind of country, maybe they wouldn't be as glamorized because they got away with it. They got away with murder. Whereas because they've paid their dues, it's
and actually had quite a miserable end as well.
Exactly. They've paid their dues. They've done their time. So we forgive them.
So it was Wilf Pine, who I mentioned earlier, who did the Krays deal for the film. Because it took quite a while, I think, to get that deal done. I think it went through a few kind of iterations, and then finally...
So the Krays had to give permission for that?
So they got a huge amount of money for it.
I didn't know that.
Huge amount of money, which they immediately gave away.
Well, yeah, I mean, doesn't that come under some kind of proceeds of crime restrictions? I wonder how they got around that.
I think not in obviously we do documentary and we have Ofcom rules that we live by, but I don't think the film world is
is
quite
that right?
so sort of
scrupulous.
Yeah, isn't it? But I think with the Kemp brothers, by playing, the story is that they were like, oh, who are these Kemp brothers? They didn't really know who the Kemp brothers were, and that they were these two good-looking young men. And Maureen Flanagan tells a story when I think she saw Ronnie or Reggie, I can't remember which one, but they're like, well, what are the Kemp brothers like? Are they going to be all right? And she's like, I think you'll be pleased. Yeah. It's okay.
They're good looking,
good looking, nice kind of pop stars.
Yeah, they'll do you right.
But, you know, you talk about the kind of glamour and the celebrity. Yeah, Richard Burton visited Ronnie in Broadmoor. Like, it's just, it's not sort of, you know, there's everyone talks about Barbara Windsor and all of that, but actually we're talking massive Hollywood stars. Charlton Heston, as I mentioned.
But I think that is that appeal of that kind of that gangster. We're always that slight kind of dalliance with the underworld. I think has always been kind of intriguing to people.
Yes, yeah, that lifestyle. We've got another viewer question. Ooh. So you've mentioned the Richardsons. What was the deal between the Krays and the Richardsons? Did they really hate each other?
It's an interesting question because actually, talking to Charlie before Charlie died, he will say, oh yeah, they're all right actually. And I think Charlie and Reggie, because they were in the same prison at one point, they're both in Parkhurst at the same time. And there's this all sort of, you know, it was like, oh, Charlie, Reggie. But actually, I think they were kind of not old enough and, you know, mature enough. But I think it wasn't in their interest to harm each other at that point. But at the time, they were both, I want to say, angry young men, you know, in their worlds. Yeah. So I think it wasn't necessarily that it was this massive gang war that people portray now. And they were both doing slightly different things. The Richardsons weren't necessarily doing everything that the Krays were doing. The Richardsons were a little bit more business orientated. They had scrapyards. They did a lot of kind of what's called firm fraud, which is kind of much more, which is why I talk about, you know, Charlie could have gone into the city because it was much more money orientated. Or there was slot machine thing that Eddie Richardson did with Frankie Fraser, whereas the Krays were much more kind of clubs, enforcing, gambling, what you'd think of more as traditional gangster, whereas actually the Richardsons were a little bit more business orientated in their criminality. Okay,
so they weren't treading on each other's toes that much.
To some extent, it was part of that image. A lot of people have said that it was Ronnie who kind of in his dream world of being an Al Capone or a kind of a mafia gang boss, to kind of claim that, you have to have gang wars.
I see. You
And so to some extent, it's possible that this rivalry was a construct,
right,
to kind of drill home this idea that they are gang bosses and they are kind of powerful, and if therefore we can take them out and kind of, or intimidate them, we can kind of show we're ruling London. I think that was very much kind of, they're very aware of their image, and part of that image was being tough gangsters, and having gang wars was part of that.
And I think you find now that the people who are still alive, they're probably all friends to a certain extent, or they all know each other. People who were on the Richardsons side or the Krays side, they're all kind of like, oh, I remember the good old days together. No, they're not quite like that, but there's an understanding of what's gone past,
right.
And they're perhaps there's an understanding of each other a little bit.
They have a shared history, and most of them ended up in prison at some point.
Exactly.
They kind of, I guess, reminisced about the good old days.
Yes.
Yeah, Charlie Richardson got 25 years for GBH.
Oh, 25 for GBH?
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Which
a stiff
is,
sentence.
Yeah, the sentencing thing, and these crimes, all of them were terrible, and they're all reprehensible and should absolutely be punished. The sentencing, if you look at the kind of the gangland sentencing of that time, is interesting. And there are lots of conspiracy theories about it, and but it is an interesting. If you look at it as well with sort of sentencing today, it is different.
That's very interesting. We've got another viewer question. Was Ronnie Kray addicted to illegal drugs, things like speed and psychedelics, and did it exacerbate his existing mental health?
I mean, again, there's a lot of people kind of suggesting that he kind of, with the story that I've heard is more that Reggie, after his wife took her own life, started doing a lot of drugs.
Yeah.
I think the issue with Ronnie more was that he didn't always take his medicine for his mental health issues. And so the stories kind of I've heard from people is that the issues arise when he wasn't taking the drugs he was meant to take. If he kind of took other drugs and that exacerbated. But yeah, I think he was kind of a deeply ill man to begin with. So I think it's possible. And if he would have taken something else, it probably would have exacerbated that greatly.
Because also, you should never forget that Ronnie wasn't, for most of his sentence, well, it wasn't a sentence, he was in prison for a short time, but he was in Broadmoor for the longest time, and Broadmoor is the hospital for the criminally insane, so that isn't actually prison. He was a patient. So yeah, it sort of goes throughout his whole life.
So I know that one of the things that comes across in your film is that actually Reggie did have aspirations to kind of go straight and to make it as a legitimate businessman. I mean, what chance was there of things like Esmeralda's Barn and for that actually becoming a really legit business? Well,
I think for Reggie especially, I think he liked the idea of simply being a kind of a club owner. And from the people I've spoken to, he was good at it. He had the charm, he had the charisma, and I think he had the kind of the want to have that as his main kind of profession. And I think what I've heard is that Ronnie, there was always part of him, even though he kind of enjoyed that as well, part of him he kind of quite liked playing the gangster. He enjoyed that, and he didn't want to have that part of his life end. So I think Reggie could have. I mean, everybody says he could have. He had the kind of skills to just be a kind of a club owner and kind of run clubs. How successful he would have been without that kind of, that side hustle. I mean, to some extent, some people are saying that they felt they had to maintain that image of being gangsters, being kind of tough men for their appeal to last. Yes. That was kind of part of their appeal. And without that, they might not have had the kind of the attention that they did. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, from everybody kind of all the books and all the people that met him, Reggie had the chance, and kind of, his brother kind of kept him, maybe not pulled him back, but kept him in the game.
Okay, interesting.
There is that. So I come back to it. It's fascinating. It depends who you talk to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's the evil Ronnie.
Yeah.
Pulled his
not so much. Not so much he pulled him back in. It's just that they couldn't be apart.
Yes.
That Reggie wouldn't have, even if he had the chance to leave, he wouldn't have wanted to leave Ronnie by himself.
So what one was doing.
It wasn't so much. Yeah, it wasn't so much that the evil Ronnie was pulling him back in. It's the fact that they dwant to be together and they didn't want to be apart.
Right. That's interesting. We're going to take another 1 minute break, so we'll see you back in a moment. Welcome back. We are here talking about the Krays, and I want to know a little bit more about these tapes. There are little snippets of them in your film, and they are absolutely fascinating. They are Ronnie and Reggie sending each other sort of taped messages.
It's just Reggie to Ronnie.
Okay. Yeah. What was the most interesting or the most surprising thing from when you listened to them?
Well, so yeah, it is interesting because it's we had to kind of piece together the kind of context, but it's clearly that Reggie. This is quite late. This is in the 90s. Reggie has heard that Ronnie's not doing so well. So this is a tape that that a brother he's trying to soothe his brother's soul, so to speak. He's kind of clearly heard that something has gone amiss. He's had a bad episode, or he's extremely depressed, or something along those lines, and he's trying to motivate his brother. He's trying to cheer up his brother, and with also, I mean, the lengths he goes through to kind of try and kind of, the various things. At first, he's kind of lecturing him. You must kind of, keep a clean cell, and if you keep a clean cell, then you have, you will be clean, and talking about, he's read a book about the kind of universal laws, and you have to be good and do good, and then you will feel good. And so there's always kind of lecture, and it's fascinating. It's this, and in a weird way, it's extremely intimate, but at the same time, it's also kind of, it's slightly naive to the fact that you're dealing with your brother who's got terrible mental health issues, and you think that this kind of lecturing will help. Yeah. So there's this kind of fascinating kind of thing where at the one time it's extremely personal and extremely intimate, and at the same time it feels slightly like he's kind of not really understanding what his brother is going through.
The best thing about the tapes, and this is the thing that's not in the documentary, and it's quite heartbreaking in some ways, is that all through the documentary, Reggie plays Elvis to Ronnie. So there's actually Elvis playing in the background because Ronnie loves Elvis. Oh. And this is Reggie trying to...
That is heartbreaking, isn't
it? And
it?
it really is. It's like, and here's your favourite music. And, it's the world according to Reggie and how to be positive. And I think it's interesting in the prison experience here from people I've spoken to who were in prison with Reggie. He was very kind of fitness orientated. He was quite regimented. He would obsessively write. So Maureen Flanagan, I remember her saying that, she'd receive letters at, say, from 3 a.m. in the morning.
Wow.
So I think it did deteriorate as the prison sentence went on. But I do think, he kind of had a positive mental attitude.
Yeah.
I
think there's still a hope that they'd get out. And that they would spend their last few years together.
Yeah, I mean, how did they cope? From people like Fred Dinage who met them, how did they cope with being apart in prison? Because after being so intertwined, then to spend years apart.
I think at times they were given monthly access.
Oh, they
so
were,
they were
okay.
allowed to see each other once a month.
And they could call each other.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And they'd have, Fred was saying, kind of, they had massive rows. So they'd have these, and this is kind of, it's basically their relationship in a nutshell, but they would have these huge rows where they'd shout each other down the phone, and by the end of it, they'd be friends again.
That's amazing. I mean, what do you even find to argue about in that context? You're not anywhere near each other. That's incredible. I guess only siblings can do that.
And Ronnie, I think, in the way that Reggie had this kind of routine, and Ronnie, I think, did quite well in Broadmoor in some ways, that he had the guards of Broadmoor not working for him, but somebody said, they sat down and the guard kind of gave the Kit Kats out, and they were looked after.
Yeah,
a lot of favours. Yes,
right.
Lots of it, and I think Ronnie had velvet curtains in his room. He was called the Colonel because of the way he dressed. He had his boys who were kind of looking after him. So
he made it work for him.
So he made it work for him. But equally, clearly from the Reggie tape, you can see it wasn't always working.
Yeah.
And that must have been quite towards the end.
Yeah, and so the tapes were sent not long before Ronnie died, as far as we know.
So as far as kind of we know, it's like it's around the time that kind of Ronnie does die, and then there's some of the tape is actually just after Ronnie dies, and Reggie kind of doing a tribute to his brother, so recounting some of the kind of his favorite memories with his brother. So there's part of the tape is directed at Ronnie, and part of it is to kind of the memory of Ronnie.
Right. Wow. Gosh, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and it's funny which memories Reggie chooses to record, and it's them having fights together as brothers in a bar, beating up some other kind of
Oh gosh, that's the reminiscence.
That's for that. I think for Reggie, that was the kind of their youth and kind of when they were at the kind of top of their power.
They like a scrap. It was a scrap.
Yeah, and actually that is a recreational activity in some people's
and also then
minds,
boxers,
so,
you know, that is actually how, you know, you talk about Violet having these twins and, you know, them becoming famous for being twins in the East End. They became famous as well for being twin boxers.
Yeah.
So and they used to, as kids, they were fighting together against other kids.
Yes.
So that was always part of the thing, and I think that was
that's really interesting. The funeral, Ronnie's funeral after he died. So that was a pretty massive affair considering he'd been off the streets.
There's a sort of a hierarchy of the Kray funerals. So I think Ronnie was the biggest. Then it went Reggie, and then it went Charlie. In terms of, but Reggie wanted Ronnie to be buried like a king.
Okay.
And it was that obviously I wasn't there, but you sort of see footage of it, and you know there are the classic kind of East End funeral tropes of the big flowers and the people, and it looked like that mafia kind of funeral, and
Horses.
there was an element of people being seen there, so they hadn't necessarily met Ronnie, but was there, and I think it's interesting because we in the Prison Years documentary I made. We have some unseen footage of Violet's funeral from the early 80s when Ronnie and Reggie are let out for a short period of time to see Violet, to send her off. And then having Reggie come out for Ronnie's. Apparently on the day that Ronnie died, Freddie Foreman says that he was allowed to go and sit, because he was in Maidstone at the time with Reggie. And Freddie Foreman was allowed to go and sit with Reggie to soothe him.
How did it affect him? How did it affect Reggie when Ronnie died?
Well, Freddie says in the interviews I've done with him, you know, he was devastated to the point where prison guards were letting him spend time with him. I don't have a sibling, so I can't even imagine what it'd be like losing a twin.
Yeah.
In those circumstances.
Yeah, and to not be able to spend their last days or hours with them as well. That's it'd be absolutely devastating.
And which is why it comes back to this is a really sad story, because they committed the worst crimes and they paid the price for it.
Yeah.
On many levels. It shows you kind of what incarceration does to them and their contemporaries.
Do they have a legacy? And if they do, what is it?
It's a very good question. I think it's different for everybody. Yeah, it's. I mean, they're an incredible kind of, they're incredible into a time that's fascinating in British kind of culture. You know, their kind of peak was in the 60s, kind of when London was the swinging 60s. And so they are intertwined with that fascinating period. And I think they always will be. They're part of the style. They're part of the kind of the criminal underbelly. They're part of the kind of glitz and glamour of that time. And they're intrinsically linked to that. And so I think that's their legacy, if it's, you know, for good or for ill. You know, some people want to kind of glamorize them. But even if you don't, they're just part of that incredible time.
I still come to the fact that crime doesn't pay. And that is, you know, that's what every documentary you finish with. Yeah, but actually, I think I've interviewed Freddie Foreman a couple of times, and his sort of view, because Freddie Foreman, he's quite a famous character in the kind of the London underworld. He's much beloved, and I suspect he's more successful than any of us know. Right. But he has this kind of very philosophical outlook about it, and which is that it's a sad story. Shouldn't have got, you know, Ronnie should not have killed George Cornell. Reggie should not have killed Jack the Hat. It's a sad story. It shouldn't have ended that way. And look what happens when you do this in your life. You know, look what Chris Lambrianis says. He missed his kids growing up. Yeah. Because he was hanging out with the wrong people. Yeah. That's a lesson to us all. Absolutely. Yeah. Agreed. Right, well, that is all we have time for. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Don't forget to watch Krays London's Gangsters, which is on Amazon Prime Video from tomorrow. And thank you to Andre, thank you to Kate, and we will see you next time.